Welcome to Harshaneeyam once again, and in this episode, we have the wonderful Damion Searls talking about his new book, The Philosophy of Translation. Coming to the book, for anyone who is interested in the creative process of translation, this is the book that you should immediately pick up and read. We have provided you a link in the show notes to buy the book. Damion Searls is a translator from German, Norwegian, French, and Dutch, and is a writer in English. He has translated about 60 books, including 10 by this year's Nobel Prize winner Jon Fosse, and won numerous translation awards, including Guggenheim and Cullman Center fellowships, and the biggest German to English translation prize in America for Uwe Johnson's 4-volume Anniversaries, and the biggest such prize in England twice for books by Keilson and Saša Stanišić. His own writing includes poetry, fiction, reviews, and 2 non-fiction books. Here is Damion Searls talking about his new book, The Philosophy of Translation.
There have been a few books in recent years that have really sort of introduced the issue of translation to readers who might not have thought about it before, and sort of laid the groundwork of giving a bit of the historical background and sort of explaining to people how it's actually creative and interesting and not just this mechanical process. And I'm thinking of particularly a book by David Bellos called Is That a Fish in Your Ear? A book by Mark Palazzati called Sympathy for the Traitor, both excellent translators from French. And then a bit earlier, Edith Grossman's book, Why Translation Matters. There are others as well. But I thought, okay, so now there doesn't need to be another one of those because there are all these good ones that are already out there. So now is a good time for a book that doesn't have to sort of defend its own existence and say, actually, translation is really interesting and all this kind of stuff, that it could sort of take that for granted and try to take another step forward. And, when I looked around, there were many academic studies of translation in the last 40 years of translation studies. But one of the last real sort of big, this is a full-on philosophy of translation books that I saw was After Babel by George Steiner from the 70s already, so quite a long time ago. And his book is very interesting, but it's also from a different time and from a different kind of author. He takes on this very Olympian, magisterial, decreeing the truth from on high kind of perspective, which is not mine and not really, I think, the perspective that people in our moment exactly want. So, I thought it was a good time to try and do a big overview of the issue, but not a sort of academic secondary source like this is this person's philosophy and this is that person's philosophy and this is what this person thinks and this is what that person thinks, because that's not my strength. That's a more academic translation studies reader type book, and that wasn't what I was interested in. I was interested in saying, here's what I think.
So, how come it has become the philosophy instead of a philosophy?
That was interesting. I had just, when I was starting to talk to the publisher, Yale University Press, about this book, I had just published a commercial nonfiction book with a commercial publishing house. Crown is one of the big commercial publishers in the US. And I had published a biography of Herman Rorschach and a history of the Rorschach test. And so when I did the proposal for this book for Yale, I had catchy glib title, really long explanatory subtitle with some superlatives. And I did a chapter outline that kind of hid all of the philosophy in the back and started with narrative, little incidents, all this kind of stuff. And the editor at Yale said, why don't you call the book The Philosophy of Translation and put the philosophy up front? That's what people want. And I was like, oh, right. University Press, you're allowed to do that. So it was his idea to call it The Philosophy of Translation. And I went through a certain amount of soul searching because, it's the 2020s can anyone dare to call a book this? And does it just sound arrogant, especially coming from an American dude, like the philosophy? Who do you think you are? Blah, blah, blah. But I did my soul searching and I ended up deciding that it wasn't coming from a place of like dictating the truth to the world. It came from a place of offering something. Like every book that's ever been written, that's ever been called the philosophy of whatever, the philosophy of nature, the philosophy of law, the philosophy of science, has always been from the outside perspective, just a philosophy that people are going to disagree with, right? But from the inside, you call it the philosophy because you mean it. And you're saying, this is what I actually think. Even though it's not God's truth that everyone is going to agree with, that it's just a philosophy among others. But if you mean it, you call it the philosophy because that's what you're trying to say. And you're just sort of putting it out there into the world, right? And I think, given my background as someone people know of as an actual practicing translator, I think title hits differently than if I was some philosophy professor.
But I gather you studied philosophy too in college.
I know, but what I'm saying is if you saw a book by some, well-known philosophy professor called The Philosophy of Translation, I think you'd be likely to at least suspect, oh, this is going to be some like out of touch, dry thing that doesn't really have anything to do with my real life, right? But if you see a book called The Philosophy of Translation by someone who's translated 10 books you've read, then you might think, oh, okay, now I'm going to get behind the scenes and see like what went into this actual product that I liked already, And what kept happening during the process of like writing and editing the book was that I would hear from people saying, oh, you're writing a book called The Philosophy of Translation. I can't wait to read that. And I don't think anyone would write me and say, oh, you're writing a book called A Philosophy of Translation. I can't wait to read that. It's less exciting. And I certainly don't think I'd get an email saying like, oh, you're writing a book called The Arrow, blah, 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 blah. I can't wait to read that because it just doesn't, that marketing is not the right thing for this audience, kind of. So I ended up deciding, yes, I have the courage to call a book The Philosophy of Translation. And at that point, every single person at Yale University Press started sending me these messages like, are you sure about that title? Don't you think you should call it A Philosophy? Including the person who originally suggested the title to me. He was one of the people saying like, I don't know about this title. What about philosophies? And I, ran through these same arguments I just gave you. And they were like, okay, I don't know, but okay. And then now that the book is out, they're all like, yes, you were right. Thank you for holding your ground. Meanwhile, it was his idea in the first place, but he was right.
This one, you talked about it in the first chapter itself. Tell us about your first attempt at translation.
Yeah, so, I started learning German, which was the second language that I really stuck with, senior year in college. I didn't grow up in a multilingual household or anything. And I then went to grad school in English, so I wasn't taking German courses or creative writing or translation or complet or anything like that. But on the side, I was continuing to do German and I enjoyed it. And there were things that I read in German and thought, oh, I want to translate this. And so I tried it. And so then I had these things, but, what do you do with them? Like, I didn't know. I wasn't in a group or a club or something. So I just started, asking around. I'm like, what do I do? And finally, my mother said, oh, why don't you look up, our old neighborhood friend, Edie? And I'm like, oh, Edie, is she a translator? And my mom said, oh, yeah, I think so. I think she gave up teaching and is translating more. And I said, oh, what language? And she said, I think Spanish. And so the neighbor I had always known since I was a child as Edie Grossman was, of course, Edith Grossman, the legendary translator from Spanish. I had like babysat her kid and like been to her apartment a few blocks away from ours in New York. And like, lo and behold, that turned out to be Edith Grossman. So I did get back in touch with her. And of course, she was happy to hear from like the childhood, neighbor, whatever. And I asked her to read my first attempt at a translation, which was a very short, like 1.5 page kind of descriptive vignette thing by Peter Handke.
He's a translator as well, Peter Handke.
He is a translator as well. I mean, he won the Nobel Prize. He was a controversial winner because of his political positions. But yes, he was a translator too. In fact, I for some reason wrote to him with this and got a strange postcard back from him that I wish I had kept, but I don't know where it is. But it was something about, thank you for this fresh and appetizing translation, whatever that means. So anyway, so I showed Edie the translation. I was like, hey, I translated something. And she's like, okay, I'll take a look. And she took a look and, she was polite about it and encouraging and stuff. And she gave me one tip. She was like, Damion, let me give you a tip. Don't use ing words when you translate. They're weak in English. Try and avoid them. Don't say there's a gleaming in the snow. Say there's a gleam. Just say there's a gleam in the snow. Don't weaken it with the ing. Don't say something was hanging in the trees if you can say it hung in the trees. That just keeps it stronger writing in English. And I had a bunch of ing words, and then she circled 3 of them and said, these 3 are okay, but all the rest you should get rid of the ing. And I went back to look at the original. Lo and behold, the 3 she had circled were the only 3 times in the German original that he used the same form that's the ing form in English. All the other times it was a noun that I could have translated as gleam, but I wasn't thinking about it, and I put gleaming, whatever. But the 3 that she said, those are good, were the ones that were there in the original. And this was a mind-blowing experience for me. She didn't read German. She didn't ever read the text, but she had read it better than I did. And I was just like, I just work here. I'm just like I'm like an open door, and you guys are communicating like right through me, and I don't know what's going on. When I've told this story over the years to other translators, they tend to not quite be as impressed. They're like, yeah, we know how participles work, right? But when I tell it but I was a non-translator then, and I was impressed. And I think I was right to be impressed, because it told me that whatever you're doing as a translator isn't just about mastery of the other language. Like, there's something else going on. The way to get from where I was to where Edie wasn't to learn German better, and wasn't even to learn English better, although that's closer. It was to learn to read better somehow, in some way that you can do even if you're reading something in a language you don't know. So somehow there's something else going on there. And translation is sort of more than I thought it was, or different than how I thought it was. So that's why I start the book off with that story.
In fact, you encapsulated the whole process of translation in a very simple, beautiful sentence. That's where the whole book starts. You said translation is a process of writing linked to reading.
Well, that's the most basic thing you can say. I think no matter what you think translation is, you've got to agree that you're reading one thing, for example, a book in another language, in Norwegian, and you're writing something, namely a book in, for example, English, and that they're connected. Like, you're reading something and you're writing something that goes with it. I think no matter what you think translation is, like, that's the most basic truth about it. And so once I start there, I say, okay, well, should we think about the writing part or should we think about the reading part? And I think the writing part is pretty much just like every other kind of writing. Like, you're trying to write well in the language you're writing in. If you're translating a Chinese poem into English, you have to be writing a poem in English that people will read in English and understand as a poem in English, and it'll mean something to them in English. That's what you're doing. You're writing under a constraint, right? You can't just be writing any old poem you feel like. You have to be writing this poem. But you're always writing under constraints. You know, there are always constraints of genre, of reader expectations, of what the words mean. Like, you don't invent what the words mean in your language. Those have been invented already, and you have to use them and work within them, and that's a constraint. So I basically feel like, and a lot of the political issues of, you know, who gets to speak and what gets to be translated and representation in translation and stuff like that, to my mind, are basically in the same boat as those issues for writing. Like, you know, we should be translating more authors from India. Yeah, we should have more Indian Americans in the publishing offices and on the prize committees. Like, it's the same zone. You know, obviously every specific thing is different, but the writing part altogether just sort of seems to be of a piece with being a writer. Like, I'm a writer in English and this is my genre. And it's the reading part that kind of makes the translate. That's sort of the center of gravity of what you're doing as a translator. What you're doing is reading.
Then, what does reading for translation involve?
Yeah, so I guess I kind of use reading two different ways in the book. On the one hand, I think there's certain qualities of reading in general that I want to emphasize and champion. And then there's certain ways that reading like a translator is a bit different than just normal reading. So let me maybe talk about both of those. The thing about reading, I love reading. Reading is amazing. Proust called it a miracle. Proust called it the fruitful miracle of communication in solitude. You get to be by yourself and still communicating with someone else who's there but not there. And the thing about reading is that it doesn't really make sense to talk about it as being either subjective or objective. If, you know, sometimes people ask me, how do you decide what words to use in this or that translation or in that situation? How do you choose something? And it always is kind of a strange question because I'm not deciding anything. To me, it's like being asked, how do you decide what Mr. Darcy looks like when you read Pride and Prejudice? It's like, I'm not deciding. The book is telling me because I'm reading the book. And the picture I have in my mind was put there as a result of my reading the book. Now, it's not 100% impersonal and objective because when you read Pride and Prejudice, the picture it puts in your mind might be different than mine. It probably will be. But you didn't just arbitrarily decide to make Mr. Darcy look that way either. You were in a reading process where the book told you that. So that, in a way, right there is the core of the philosophy of translation, that it's not you over here and some original over there, and you're like doing something to it. You're not importing it. You're not choosing to make it look like this or that. You're reading it, and you're in this kind of living two-way process where the book is telling you something. And so it's never that like I'm choosing this word to put in the translation. It's that the book is telling me that, you know, because I'm reading it. And that's why we don't really say, oh, you read Anna Karenina. Was it a faithful reading? Like, that doesn't make sense because everyone knows that engagement with reading a book isn't like photocopying it into your mind, right? It's engaging with it. So they don't bother asking, did you read it faithfully? Because that just doesn't make any sense. Or did you read it freely? But that's the question that gets asked about translation because people don't really understand translation as a kind of reading. They understand it as a kind of copying, right? So that's why they say, oh, is it a faithful copy of the book you're translating? And it's like, well, that's not what books produce. They don't produce copies. They get read and people read them. And so if my translation is good, then that means I've read the book well and have kind of conveyed my reading of the book in this other language, English. So that's a sense in which even before you get into the details that like reading with a translator's eye is a little bit different, just the mere fact of reading, if you unpack it, kind of addresses all of these issues about translation.
You mean to say reading as a translator involves some special skill in which you have to train yourself in?
Well, okay, so the reading like a translator part, which is the second half I promised a second ago, is that, I think normally when you read, you just kind of get it. You're not necessarily paying attention to the words. You're paying attention to the story or the description or whatever it is. I kind of learned this lesson, although I didn't quite appreciate how important it was, many years ago at the beginning of my time as a translator, where I was stuck on something and I thought, well, I'll just ask someone. So specifically, it was, I don't know, there's a bus line in a sort of suburb or country area, and then the road ends, and at the last stop, there's a bus stop, and then the road makes a little loop. So the bus cannot go into reverse. It can drive forward, but it loops around. And then it's back at the same bus stop facing the other way, and it's about to go back on the road, right? So there's that little loop in the road. And what is that called? So this is actually the like bread and butter life of the translator. It's not trying to figure out what does this word mean. It's trying to figure out, I know what it means, but how do you say it? I know what it means, but what is it called? And sometimes that's things like, I'm in some conversation and I say, so how do you say that? Like, how do you write, Do you say he grunted? Do you say he sighed? Do you try and spell it? Like, I know what it is, but how do you say it? And so in the case of this bus thing, it was sort of before the internet really. And even on the internet, you can't look something up if you don't know what it's called, because you can't look it up. You can try and look up parts of a bus road and hope there's a diagram, but like maybe there won't be. And so in any case, that wasn't an option. And all I could think of was a roundabout, but I felt like that would sound like it meant what is also called a traffic circle. So instead of an intersection with a stoplight or a stop sign, you have to loop around this central circle to take any of the exits. And so I didn't want to call it a roundabout because I thought that would be confusing. And so I was like, all right, I'll ask a bus driver, So I got on a bus in one of these areas and I waited till there wasn't much traffic. And then I went up and said, excuse me, sorry to bother you. I'm a translator. I have a kind of strange question. And he was like, yeah, what? And, so I explained, and I said, what do you call that? And he said, it's the end of the line. So I had said, what do you call that? But he had said what it is. It's the end of the line. That's what it is. That's his life. That's how he uses it. And I tried to be like, oh, great, thanks. Yeah, but, if you were walking across the field and you came to it, so you weren't driving on it, but you were just talking about it, what would you call it? And he said, I'd call it the end of the line. And I was like, okay, thanks. And I stopped bothering him. But that's the difference in a way between reading like a translator versus reading. In other words, I was trying to think like a translator about the word and how the word connects to the meaning in the language. And he was just using language to make his point, which is that that's the end of the line. And you don't think about the word at all. And then more specifically, I guess, let me give it one more example, if it's not too much, about how this plays out. So one thing that I never learned in German class, no one ever really teaches you, it's just one of those subtle things about the language, is that in German, it's much more common than in English to use a construction that means not this, but that. You say the train leaves at not 6, but 5:30. Or, I'm hungry, I want a not kale salad, but a cheeseburger. You kind of loop around that way. And in English, this feels like some crazy little detour. Like, why are you throwing this in my way? Like, just tell me. Because English likes to sort of say the thing first and then add on explanations afterwards. So like, the train leaves at 5:30, not 6. You told us 6, so now we're late. But you start with the main thing. I want a cheeseburger today, not just a kale salad, right? That's how you write in English or speak in English. And in German, though, it isn't a maddening little detour. It actually is part of the language. It sort of feels, in a way, you feel cared for when you hear a sentence like that, because it's like the speaker is trying to bring you closer and closer with them. So it actually doesn't feel annoying. It feels nice. Like, that's how the language works. So fair enough. I had never really noticed that. I'd be translating a sentence and I would just flip it around and say, train leaves at 5:30, not 6. Or every so often, we can say not this, but that in English. And it's not that, bizarre or unusual. So every once in a while you have a sentence like that and it's fine. But then I was translating this one book where it just kept coming up over and over and over again. All my first drafts had all these sentences that were like, not this, but that, not this, but that. And that was when I noticed it and started to think about it. And that was when I got to what I started this explanation just now by saying, like, oh, the German language works that way and the English language works this way, right? And why was this author using this tick so much? It's because slowly homing in on the truth, because we care enough to keep digging and investigating until we get it right, is at the absolute core of his whole art and life and mind. Like, that's who he is. This is a writer named Uwe Johnson. I'm talking about a book called ANNIVERSARIES, which I've sometimes said is the least post-truth book ever written. Like, all it cares about is homing in on the truth and getting it right. And that's why he uses this German pattern so much, because it's what matters to him. And so now there's a translation problem, because we can't just flip it around. It's not just like verb at the end of the sentence or a capitalized noun or some aspect of the German language that you get rid of because you're translating into English. Now it's not just the language, it's him. And yet you can't express what he's doing by overusing the not this but that pattern in English, because it just seems weird and bad. So in a way, you have to do the same thing, but starting off from the baseline of a totally different language with totally different structures. So that's the part that's reading like a translator. In other words, I have to read his sentence that has not this but that and kind of factor out what is just a tick of the language, like verbs at the end, versus what is something that he's particularly artistically trying to do in this moment. And if there's anything in that second category, I have to somehow make that happen without any of the tools that he's using to make it happen with. So that kind of disentangling of the baseline of the language from this particular use of the language is, I feel like, the key moment of reading like a translator. you're not just saying the same thing. You're looking at how the author's saying it with their language so that you can do the same thing with the totally different language.
One of the most powerful arguments you made in the book for me is that you said we don't translate for words, we translate for uses of the language. Could you please elaborate on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's that goes in so many different directions if you unpack it in different directions. But really, what it speaks to is this wrong idea that people have that translating is copying something. You're just copying the other book. You're copying those words, but putting them into English words. But that's not what a translator is doing. And that's also not what the writer is doing in the first place. It's not like a word that you're running across in this sentence always means the same thing, no matter who speaks it or writes it in what book, wherever you encounter it in your whole life. It's not this frozen, fixed thing. It's being used by the writer. And so, I mean, of course, a super simple example is take the words good morning. If your spouse has slept in until 2 p.m. and they stumble out of the bedroom and you're like, oh, good morning, then morning doesn't mean morning. It means afternoon. Or if a disaster has just happened and you're all staggering around and your eyes are glazed and you can't believe the new world you're living in, and you're like, oh, good morning, then good doesn't mean good. And like those seem like, oh, that's cheating. That's just being sarcastic. But that's the point. Like a person is using the language to mean something. And so in terms of like literary translation more specifically, it means that, you know, your goal isn't exactly to find the word that matches what the other word is. You're trying to find something that does the same thing that the text did to you when you read it. You know, and that's just not something that happens on a word level. Even if there's a nonsense word, you have to try and find a nonsense word that feels the same or does the same, even though it doesn't mean anything. Or even something like proper names, you know, are not just going to be the same once you've put them in another book. Maybe all those accents will look crazy and weird to the reader in the language you're putting it into, and so you take some of them out. Or maybe it's a reference, like a family of sisters is named Rose, Lily, and Violet in English, then I could imagine translating that into another language, not just spelling Rose, Lily, and Violet in another language in a way that wouldn't mean anything to the reader, right? So it's just that, so it's not just that we don't translate words, it's that we don't read words. We don't speak words. We say things. We are like people doing something with language. And the sort of whole pattern of our behavior is much more important than this or that individual word. You know, if someone's talking to you and they slip up and say the wrong word, you still know what they're saying because you're in a communicative situation and you understand the context, and, you know, it doesn't matter that they mispronounced something or misspelled it or whatever. You know, it's not that in fact you're going from the words to the process of understanding.
Some of the examples that you have given in the book, especially the one where I guess in Septology, the Jon Fosse's novel that you translated beautifully, in that you had to change the name of the dog.
There's so Jon Fosse, a Norwegian writer I translate, his magnum opus is Septology, and there is a dog character. So the main character, painter, has this sort of double who ends up in the hospital, and the main character realizes, oh, I have to go get his dog because no one was there to look after his dog because the guy's in the hospital. So he goes and like adopts this dog. And it's just a great little dog character. He like runs around in circles and pees in the snow and like sleeps in the back seat of the car on long trips and sits in his lap, and every so often looks up with his beautiful dog eyes that understand everything about the universe but can't communicate it because it's a dog. But, you know, it's this great dog character. And, like, people have told me they love this character. And the character's name in Norwegian is Brage, which is Brage, Brage. And so, as usual, of course, in my draft of the translation, I just copied the name because that's his name, Brage, right? And luckily, in the last round of sort of edits, it suddenly clicked in my mind that the English reader would read this as Brage. You know, rhymes with page, rhymes with rage. Brage is a very bad dog name. And in fact, once I was thinking about it, even Brage is kind of heavy. Like, it works in Norwegian, but in English, Brage is kind of like, ugh. So I was like, I should change the name. That's what I should do. And so Fosse, as a living author, I emailed him. I asked him. I was like, oh, where are you going for with Brage? And he reminded me that Brage is the Norse god of poetry, which I had, you know, I'd read my books of Norse myths. I'm like educated in that. But that was always spelled Bragi, Bragi, because the books of Norse myths use the Icelandic spelling, which is the Old Norse spelling. So it didn't click for me that Brage is Bragi. But there's a Brage Prize. It's like it's like a Pulitzer Prize. It's a famous prize in Norway for writers and stuff like that. But it hadn't clicked for me, and he reminded me. And then I was like, oh, Bragi. Now, that's a good name. It's not going to get mispronounced. It subliminally rhymes with doggy, at least for me. Like, in some pronunciations of English, it doesn't, but for me, it does. More importantly, a reader like me who wouldn't get that Brage is the god of poetry would get that Bragi is the god of poetry, because I would have gotten it. So I know that my readers who are like me would have gotten it too. And that makes the whole thing even funny. If you name this like silly little lapdog Orpheus or, you know, Apollo or something, it's hilarious. So I did a quick search and replace, and Brage became Bragi. And I am totally convinced that English language readers love Bragi as much as they do because it's Bragi. I mean, not 100% because, but they at least love it 5% more than they would have loved Brage, you know, or Brage, depending on how well they know how to pronounce Norwegian. So, you know, that's a way of saying that names or spellings don't function the same way in different languages. So you can't just automatically transport it and assume it's going to do the same thing. If Tolstoy has characters speaking French in War and Peace, you can just transplant the French into your English translation and have a bunch of French, but you can't assume that that's the right answer. You can't assume that that'll work the same way in your English novel War and Peace as it worked in Tolstoy's 19th century novel Vojna i Mir. Like, things that would be like saying that there's a chair that looks the same from whatever angle in the universe you look at it from. That's just not how seeing works. And that's just not how reading works. There's nothing that somehow is out of time and space, and you never have to think about its relationship to the new contexts in the new language.
And even the example about changing the name of the novel.
Yeah, so that was a case where Fosse's book After Septology, which everyone was eagerly waiting to see what it would be, was an extremely short book, somewhat spooky. And the translation in Norwegian, the title in Norwegian is Kvittleik, which means whiteness. Kvitt means white, same word. That's why it's spelled WH, because of the old KV thing in there. And and like, it just turns it from an adjective white into a noun whiteness. So it very literally means whiteness. And it's about this guy wandering in the forest and seeing these spooky shapes that are white. So he sees this whiteness in the forest. But I knew immediately that his novel could not be called Whiteness, because in English today, a book called Whiteness is about race and about privilege. And, you know, of course you can give that kind of reading to the book, but that's not what the book is about, really. It's not what it is. And it would just be misleading, and it wouldn't be a good translation to call it Whiteness. So there was a case where I had to take more liberties, you might say. But it wasn't like I was just arbitrarily forcing whatever I felt like onto the book. It was that my reading of the Norwegian title didn't match how I anticipated English readers would read a title Whiteness. And my job is to make it match more closely. So what I ended up calling it was A Shining, because there's a shining whiteness. Shining is a word that comes up a lot in the book, as well as whiteness. And it actually is a nice sort of spooky association that isn't in the original, namely The Shining, the Kubrick movie, the Stephen King novel, right? So A Shining sort of gives you a sense of something supernatural or creepy going on. And I felt that it did for the English book what the Norwegian title was doing for the Norwegian book, right? And so that too, you could say in terms of, I wasn't translating the word, I was translating the use. Because I know that kvitt-like doesn't mean shining, it means whiteness. Like, that's what the word by itself means. But the word wasn't existing by itself. It was the title of this book.
We talked about the association, and you also talked about the sound, register, and movement.
Yeah, you know, so at some point in the book, the way the book is set up is that the first half kind of gives a history of our idea of translation and goes through some of the philosophy stuff that we've been talking about now. In a way, the stuff about how reading doesn't make sense to call it totally subjective or totally objective. Like, that's basically the core of the philosophy part that I talk about in a more philosophical way. And then the second half of the book is largely examples, mostly from my own experience, just because I know them. I know those examples. And kind of playing out those examples with an eye to the bigger picture I laid out in the first half. And how is this an example of it? And what do we have to do in this kind of situation and stuff like that. So at some, after I think the longest chapter in the book, which is about how you don't just translate words. I mean, of course, whenever you talk about translation, you have to like pick out a word or two and talk about it, which I do too. But you have to keep in your mind that like really the issue isn't just the word by itself. So even when you and I are talking about kvitt-like, it's just one word, and we're talking about how to translate that one word, but it's in the context of the whole thing. We're not just like looking up kvitt-like in the dictionary. So anyway, after that long chapter, I try and be like, okay, so what are we translating for if it's not the words? What I think we're ultimately translating for is what we've talked about in terms of the energy or the force. Like, how does it work on you? How does it strike you? What does this, not this, but that construction do? And when you read it, how does it act on you? Like, those sorts of metaphors of force or impact or something is probably my main thing. But that's a bit vague and abstract. So I try and say, well, okay, if you're a translator, like, what else are you looking at? Well, you're looking at the sounds of words because, for example, if you're translating rhyming poetry, it has to rhyme, or maybe it has to rhyme, or you have to think about it rhyming. If you're translating something normal and it comes out sounding crazy just because of the random quirks of the sounds, you have to change it. I give an example of Weber, as a famous line about politics is, uh, laborious boring of holes through hard boards. And in English, that sounds ridiculous because it's boring, laborious, and boards. Even though those words have nothing to do with each other, they happen to have that same sound. So you can't translate it that way. So yeah, there's the sound, there's the associations of the words. If the literal translation is whiteness and whiteness has totally different associations, it's not the best translation. There's the register, which is the kind of word for level. Like obviously in dialogue, if you have a kid talking, then you have to make it sound like a kid talking. Even if it's a precocious kid, it has to sound like a kid. Like you can't make it sound like a chemistry textbook if it's supposed to be some 6-year-old coming into the room and talking to mom, right? So, and then another thing I talk about is movement, which is in some ways getting to be pretty amorphous like force is. But the thing is that language, we're all people and we're all encountering language, whether it's spoken or written, in a certain order. And that order or rhythm really is a huge part of our reading experience. So it's just something to keep in mind when you're translating, like, and it raises the same kind of issue as the not this but that I was talking about before. You might remember I said like, oh, well, in German, all the verbs go at the end of the sentence, and obviously you don't keep that. But some German writers use that meaningfully. And so you don't just want to get the word away from the verb away from the end of the sentence, because because there too, it's not just a tick of German anymore. It's part of what the writer's doing. And you have to figure out some other way to create suspense or to give the reader information in a different order or whatever. Word order is the most concrete issue around movement, because what order does the information come to you in is staging your experience just as much as the plot of a book, which doesn't tell you everything in chronological order, is how you're reading the book. And it's crucial. Like you can't just translate a book where you find out at the end who the murderer was by putting the murderer at the beginning since it happened first. Like you can't do that, obviously. But on the sentence level, that kind of thing is going on too.
In the last chapter of the book, you made an interesting observation saying that the association that the translator has with the languages that he or she is working in, that too plays an important role in the process of translation.
Yeah. So, I guess I felt this as part of my responsibility in writing a book called The Philosophy of Translation, that even though I'm writing from experience and my experience as a translator of a lot of books, nobody's experience encompasses everything. And a lot of people have different experiences than mine. And I wanted to address how we could think about those experiences in the framework I'm talking about. So it's not just, even if I'm not totally able to like bounds of my own selfhood and truly grasp everyone else's experience in the world, like I'm making an effort to say like, okay, my experience as someone who grew up in New York City in America as an English speaker, learning other languages in a school context, not from family, not from some background of immigration or being expelled from a country, without kind of much political overtones. I just sort of picked whichever language I felt like learning. That is not a universal or representative experience. That's just the one that's my experience, So people who have other relationships to their languages they're translating from or to are not going to have feelings or attitudes that necessarily match mine. And I don't want to assume that they don't exist or assume that they're less interesting or relevant. I want to do my best to acknowledge them and talk about them and sort of bring them into the picture I'm trying to paint of how translation works. So I do, more than quoting other philosophers in this book, what I do towards the end is quote other translators and their essays about their own experience and their descriptions of, their interactions with these different languages. A Korean translator translating from Korean into English, the language of the colonial oppressor that absolutely dominated and shaped her childhood, has different concerns than me who learned German in college versus English.
Do you think that has affected the way she translated the work into English?
Well, of course it does. Just like my background affects the way I translate. And, she has written very eloquently and beautifully about how it affects her translations. So I don't want to ignore all that just because I personally haven't had those experiences, right? Yeah, so I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it is worth saying that, I try to not just universalize my personal experience and say the kinds of issues I have are the issues of translation. I'm trying to understand what my process and my issues are in a way that, is less narrow, and that even people with different experiences, it kind of makes sense to talk about in the same book. I mean, what do you think? Do you think that those other translators I described kind of broke the wall of the book, or do you think that I brought them in?
No, I understood why you were writing about the specific experiences. That is, you made it very clear in the book. But after reading everything, especially the last chapter, the way you tended, uh, you have to tell me whether I get it right. Right? I felt like any other art form. I felt a literary translation is a very purely personalized reflection on what you have experienced. In this case, reading. Is that correct? Would you subscribe to that?
Sure, I'd agree with that. And that isn't the end of the discussion, right? Because, if you want to be political about it, you could say, well, some people's experience are more valued and more able to be held up as representative than other people's experience. So you can't just kind of end the discussion by saying, well, this is just what I think. Because sure, it is what I think, and other people think different things, and we can engage with other people. There, in everything, and maybe especially in translation, there are these two kind of opposite hazards, the Scylla and Charybdis, of, on the one hand, saying like, well, everyone's different. I couldn't possibly understand you because you have a different experience. So that's it. I'm writing you off. I'm not even going to try. I'm not going to listen to what you have to say because how could I possibly understand it? And so why bother? You're you, I'm me, we're different, the end. Obviously that is a kind of selfish, closed off, narcissistic way of living. Just preemptively saying like, nope, couldn't possibly understand you, right? On the other extreme, they're saying, I can understand everybody. My framework encompasses all of the world. And anything that I run across, I can just redescribe in my own terms, and my own terms are perfectly valid. And how could anyone have a problem with that? Because after all, different people can understand each other, and I'm understanding you. So like that has its problems too. That is very dismissive and arrogant and sort of actually erasing aspects of other people's perspectives that I might think I understand, but I actually don't, right? So you don't want to do either of those two things. You want to engage with different people, books, cultures, worldviews, right? From a position where you're open to them, but not from a position where you're blind to the friction between the two views, or you just deny that there could possibly be any limitations to your own view or whatever, right? So, that's probably my ultimate perspective. And I think that's a very translatory perspective because, here I am. I'm reading books in other languages, but believing that an English book is worth doing, that, will share with English language readers what they can't get directly from this Norwegian language book, right? I'm not claiming it's the same. I'm not claiming it's the only translation. I'm not claiming it's the best translation. I'm just claiming that it's a translation. And now you non-Norwegian readers can read this book in an English translation. And, that has its good points.
Okay. Finally, what are you currently working on, Damion?
What am I currently working on? Well, as most of your listeners probably know, Fosse won the Nobel Prize last year. So there will be a lot of Fosse books in my future. There's the backlist of children's books. There's the backlist of his early novels that weren't translated at the time into English. He's continuing to write. He's written a series of 3 more novels that I've translated the first one. It's coming out next year. And so happily for me, there's a lot more Fosse, and that's great because he's a great writer and I love translating him. Unfortunately for me, if I were to work full-time on Fosse and produce, multiple books a year, like an English publisher couldn't publish them. Like they're not going to publish 8 Fosse books in 1 year, right? So I have to do other things and stretch out the pleasure of the Fosse. So yeah, I'm doing this and that with translation. I'm translating the other major book by Uwe Johnson, who wrote Anniversaries, which is a retranslation. And I'm also putting a bit more focus, I guess, on my own writing. So for example, this book, I didn't translate, so I wrote it, and I'm giving podcasts and talking about this book. A chapbook of poetry I wrote and a novel I wrote are coming out next year. And I'm sort of putting some energy into other stuff of mine as opposed to translations. But yeah, my translation job is on good footing because there's more Fosse and people want it, and he likes me to translate it and I like doing it. So even if that's not going to be everything full time for the next however many years, there's going to be more of that for quite a while, which is great.
Thank you, Damion. Thank you for your time. And as always, such a wonderful experience, really, listening to you talking about the process of translation and your work. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much.